Welcome, Dr. Josh, to Esoteric Thoughts.
Thank you.
Your book does a great job in discussing the dating and validity of the book of Daniel. Before you go into detail, can you please start by explaining to the viewers what anachronism is?
Yeah. So anachronism is, and this is a question I didn't know. I don't think I remember this one was coming, but that's good. Hey, keep me on my toes. So anachronism is when you say something that is appropriate for a later time, but inappropriate for an earlier time. So, for example, if I think the example that I give in the book is, if we had a document that was purported to have been written by like Shakespeare, and it said, "What ho, my dude," right? Like my dude, that's a little weird. Or if it were to say, as we saw in the, as happened in 9/11, right? Well, wait a minute, like that's anachronistic, right? To see this later thing, it's sort of a giveaway. It's in the wrong time. So we see this sort of thing in the book of Genesis, for example, when the writer says Abraham came from Ur of the Chaldeans. Well, that doesn't really work. The Chaldeans are a group that are in Babylonia, in southern Mesopotamia, in the first millennium, right? So they're not a group back in the purported time of Abraham. That's not when they're there. So that's a real problem. It's anachronistic. So those sorts of things are giveaways to people that are coming to the text critically and saying, wait a minute, this thing says that it's written back then, but gosh, that's a late thing. That wasn't real back then. That tells us something about the text.
And how would that apply to the dating of Daniel, the book of Daniel?
So Daniel is a book that if you read it on its face, it purports to be written by a guy named Daniel, or be about a guy named Daniel in other parts of it, in the 6th century BCE. So, the time that Nebuchadnezzar, king of the Neo-Babylonian Empire, comes and deports a bunch of people from the south, from Judah, over to Babylonia, and Daniel's supposed to be among this group, and he becomes very successful in the court, Neo-Babylonian court, and so you see him interacting at this very elite level. While he's there during this period, end of the 6th century, beginning of the 5th century, you see him talking about or receiving visions or dreams about much later time periods. So he talks about in general, these major kingdoms that are coming. So he talks about the Neo-Babylonian Empire, and he talks about the Persian Empire, the Median Empire, and then the Grecian Empire. And following the Greeks, and the division that came after Alexander the Great, you have the coming kingdom of God, right? So if you just read the text, take it as it stands, you'd say, all right, this guy's writing in the 6th century or early 5th century, and he's prophesying about things that are coming in the future. The problem is that when you actually sort of dig down into the book, there's a very consistent pattern that you see. The earlier events, chronologically speaking, the ones that Daniel's supposed to be living through, they're very general, sort of vague, and like, oh, this kingdom will reign, right? But it doesn't go into a great deal of detail about these earlier periods. And not only that, but he gets some of the details wrong, sometimes some pretty big details wrong. But when he's talking about the later periods, when he's talking about, particularly down in the Greek Empire, after Alexander dies, and his kingdom is broken up, and there's this sort of warring between the Ptolemies and the Seleucids. Man, things get really detailed. Chapters, particularly in chapter 11. I mean, it's like, this king will go do this, and he will fight against this other king, and they will form this alliance, and this woman will marry this king, but only for a short period of time, and then there'll be a problem with that, and family dies. I mean, it's like, it's not just this kingdom will reign. It's, very detailed. Now, it still lacks particular specificity with names. Not always, but most of the time. So instead of saying the Seleucids or the Ptolemies, it'll say the king of the north or the king of the south. But it's very clear, if you know the history of the period, what they're talking about. So if you think about those two things just in general, earlier, when he's supposed to be alive, the history is very general, sort of vague, and he gets several details wrong, sometimes big details wrong. But then later, when he's not supposed to be alive and he's prophesying about this, that period is very, very detailed, relatively speaking. And it's so accurate, right? That when scholars come to that, if you just had nothing else, you would look at that and you would say, the example that I give, just very quickly, is I talk about if we had a document that purported to be a prophecy by, I think Thomas Jefferson is who I said it was by. And in the document, it said, after the nation is formed, brother will fight against brother in a war between the North and the South. And following this, there will be a great revolution when the nation will free itself from, its enemy to the east. I think Thomas Jefferson probably shouldn't get the Civil War and the Revolutionary War out of order, right? Should probably get those right. But then if it said later on, and during the campaign, the man of the tower, who has no political experience, will rise up in the polls, much to the chagrin of many, and the former senator will, and they will have the first debate, and in the first debate, they will argue these things with each other. You'd be like, wait a minute, like, gets the Revolutionary and Civil War out of order around the time that he really should be getting those right. But then this time, much, much later, it's not just like there's going to be a president. It's talking about the details of the presidential race between Trump and Hillary Clinton. Something is afoot, right? I think is what we would say. And so we would likely say, well, this text was written later and it's a forgery, right? Forgery is not always a strong word, but it's like it's a later text that's trying to get you to think it was written by somebody back then, and it wasn't.
So suffice to say that the prophecy as such is not a prophecy.
Yeah, and I think one of the ways that we can tell that actually pretty clearly is that there actually is, I think, a genuine prophecy in the book of Daniel. And in Daniel chapter 11, I think it's down in verse 35. There's debate about where it starts, but right around between 35 and 40. It seems like the writer is actually making a genuine prediction about Antiochus IV Epiphanes, the ruler who is supposed to be who this whole series of events is about. And if you read through the text and compare it to what we know historically speaking, it's like precise. And then right at this point, between 35 and 40, it's like wrong, it's just wrong. So I liken this to, in that text, that I was my hypothetical text by George, the prophecy by Thomas Jefferson. Had the text said, but fear not, citizens of these United States or whatever, God will not allow the man of the tower to be victorious over the senator. But in the end, in the last hour, the man of the tower will suffer a great illness and will no longer be able to participate in the race, and therefore the senator. So God's will be, so hold fast, Americans. Don't give up hope. The man of the tower, God will not allow the man of the tower to win. Well, like, we would look at that and say, well, if we're trying to date this text, he gets all these details right about the 2016 presidential election, right up until the end. And then at the end, he makes this genuine prediction that Trump won't win, but Trump does win. So that tells us that he wrote this sometime in 2016, probably during the summer or something. And that's what they do with the book of Daniel. So all these events in the, the 160s, early 160s, mid 160s, boom, 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 they're all right. And then right at this point, it just all goes awry. And so scholars say, well, this book, at least this section of the book, was penned, I can't remember. It's like the summer of 165 or something. Like they can narrow it down. I don't have that date memorized, but they narrow it down that precisely. And it fits very well with the purpose of the book of Daniel. And we could talk about that if you want, or if you want to go in a different direction, we can. But so the book of Daniel is an apocalyptic text. And what apocalyptic literature does is, amongst other things, it's like its purpose, its goal, is to embolden the people for whom it is written. It's one of its main functions. So if you think about the book of Daniel is written in such a way that it's telling people that are living in the 2nd century under this tremendous persecution of Antiochus IV Epiphanes, who is doing all these, terrible things in their minds and in reality. Hold on to the faith, right? So let's say it this way, going back to our example about the presidential race. If the whole country were like, oh my gosh, what will happen if Trump gets in office? The whole world's going to fall apart. If God were sending his messenger to embolden the people to say, look, don't go over to Trump's side. Don't give in to the pressures of the rest of the nation or whatever. Like, hold fast. Don't give up on your convictions. Stand behind Senator Clinton. Then the message would certainly be, one, it's all going to be okay. But it's not all going to be okay right now. There's this little bit of time left. You're going to have to endure it. It's going to get bad, but hold fast. Hold on to your faith. Hold on to, trust in me, because it's just a little bit longer that you've got to hang on. And then God's going to come back and everything's going to be great. That's exactly what you see in apocalyptic literature, particularly here in the book of Daniel. So the author is trying to get his, the Jewish people there not to fall away from the faith, right? To hold on to their faith. And of course, holding on to it meant persecution. And so what he's trying to say is, like, trust God. God's in control. Well, how do you do that? Well, you have a prophecy. Look, a text that was written hundreds of years ago. And not only did it foretell the future, but look, it foretold it in great detail. Look at all it shows Antiochus Epiphanes right here. Like, you can trust this book. And what does it say? Well, a little bit longer, just a little bit, couple more years, and God's coming back. And man, he's going to mess up your enemies. So just don't give up. Boy, don't go to the dark side, right? Stay with the good side of the force or whatever. Yeah. Great at Star Wars. But hang tough, because God's in control. And you want to stay on his good side. And you want to stay in you don't want to be on the bad side that's going to get destroyed when God comes. And that's what apocalyptic literature does. And it's the same thing that we see in the book of Revelation, right? This is what apocalyptic literature does. It's don't lose faith. Hang on just a little bit longer. God's going to come back.
Thank you, Dr. Josh.